Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brandon, and today I'm here to do my talk on neighborhood characteristics and minority friendships, understanding their influence on acculturative dissonance. So the present study is looking into two different questions. The first one is, are there differences in acculturative dissonance among ethnic groups? And what are the specific neighborhood characteristics such as dissimilarity, isolation, and exposure, as well as minority friendships? How do they relate to acculturative dissonance among a diverse group of young adults? So acculturative dissonance involves the conflict between one's culture of origin and a new culture that they're exposed to. It can impact one's health outcomes, discrimination processing, and also their perceptions and integration into the community. And it's often seen as a negative outcome. However, there are aspects to address this, like having different support groups or different coping strategies to address acculturative dissonance. And acculturative dissonance can also have positive outcomes, such as having empathy or empathy towards people who are culturally different and having or engaging in pro-social behaviors. Acculturative dissonance can be influenced by one's friendships, relationships with parents, neighborhood characteristics, especially friendships that are cross-grades as well. The racial aspects of neighborhood characteristics involve dissimilarity between one's group and other groups, isolation of your own racial group, and exposure to groups different than your own. Research has identified neighborhood characteristics affecting acculturative dissonance among different ethnic groups such as Latinx and Asian Americans. Specifically with dissimilarity and exposure, it was positively associated with more conflict or more distress and a renegotiation of one's identity, whereas racial isolation was seen to have a negative predictive power. It's also important to note that previous research has also examined African Americans, their acculturation process, and acculturative dissonance, yet there is no research that has examined this relationship with neighborhood characteristics and acculturative dissonance with African American participants, which is highlighting a gap in the present research. Another important aspect to consider is intergroup contact or one's contact with people who are culturally different. This has shown to have a positive prediction of acculturative dissonance. Going back to the factors of the study, these factors such as dissimilarity, exposure, and minority friends are aspects that imply or measure different aspects of intergroup contact. Specifically with dissimilarity and exposure, it's the quantity of intergroup contact, whereas minority friends is more of the quality of intergroup contact. Racial isolation is in one neighborhood limits opportunities for intergroup contact. This is because your racial group would be isolated within your neighborhood, which again would limit opportunities for intergroup contact. Based on the previous literature and gaps in the research, we made two hypotheses to answer our research questions. First, we expect minority groups to exhibit higher rates of acculturative dissonance compared to white Americans. And second, we expect neighborhood characteristics that imply intergroup contact, such as dissimilarity, exposure, and the percentage of minority friends, to predict higher rates of acculturative dissonance, whereas racial isolation would predict lower rates of acculturative dissonance. Our study consisted of 483 participants, 75 of which were women, and the mean age was 20.6. We also had a fairly diverse sample of ethnic racial demographics, with the exception of African Americans, which consisted only of 2.9% of our sample. To measure acculturative dissonance, we used the Lee and Stockdale's acculturative dissonance scale, which measures acculturative dissonance, right? The conflict between one's culture of origin and a new or dominant culture. We also asked participants about their friendships, their friends, and the ethnicity of those friends to calculate their percentage of minority friends, which range from 0 to 1. Finally, participants provided identifiers of their residency or their neighborhoods, such as their zip codes, and we used that alongside the 2010 US Census Bureau to calculate residential dissimilarity, isolation, and exposure. And each index ranged from 0 to 100. To go into more specifics about each index, the dissimilarity index compared the population of the participants' ethnic group with the majority group within that residential population. So a higher score would indicate a higher proportion of the majority group living within that residential area. The isolation index is the percentage of same group population in a residential area, and a higher score would indicate that their group is very isolated ethnically compared to other groups. And then finally, the exposure index is the ratio of the residential groups that a participant is exposed to that is different than their own racial group. So a higher score would indicate more diversity within that neighborhood. So to test our first hypothesis, a one-way ANOVA was conducted to assess these differences across ethnic groups, and it was statistically significant. And then we did a post hoc analysis using Tukey that indicated significant differences between white American and minority populations with a p-value of less than 0.001. However, it was not significant between different minority groups. In table 1 here, you can see the means of each group, and you notice that white Americans scored the lowest compared to the other minority groups. This is also highlighted in our figure, which is a bar graph showing, again, these means, again, showing white Americans as a low scoring group compared to other minority groups in acculturative dissonance. This table shows the correlations, means, and standard deviations of all of our variables. You'll see here that every variable was significantly correlated with each other, with the exception of dissimilarity and isolation. And then to test our second hypothesis, we ran a hierarchical regression to assess these differences. In model 1, we used the neighborhood characteristics, and then in model 2, we included the percentage of minority friends. So going back to model 1, it was significant and accounted for 5% of the total explained variance, with the only significant predictor being isolation, being a negative predictor, indicating higher isolation of other groups predicted lower acculturative dissonance. In model 2, with the inclusion of minority friends, an R-squared change of 0.01 indicated a 1% additional explained variance when minority friends was included. And isolation remained significant, suggesting it's a consistent predictor. And the percentage of minority friends was a positive predictor, indicating having more minority friends was predictive of having higher rates of acculturative dissonance. Here's a table of the results for our hierarchical regression, and again, you'll notice that isolation was the only predictor that was significant in model 1, and then in model 2, isolation and minority friends was significant. The main findings I wanted to highlight for this study were that higher isolation was associated with lower rates of acculturative dissonance. This can be interpreted as individuals who are more isolated in their neighborhood would have limited opportunities to interact with people of different cultures, and thus having less opportunities to have experiences of acculturative dissonance, because there's less intergroup contact. Second, having greater percentage of minority friends was associated with more acculturative dissonance. Individuals with minority friends may have more cultural engagement or awareness of these differences, which could lead to more acculturative dissonance or more conflict. And then finally, dissimilarity and exposure were not significant, which would indicate that mere diversity does not play a role in acculturative dissonance. This study also had some limitations, such as demographic limitations that limit the generalizability of the study, such as the sample being mostly young adults, mostly women, and having a small sample of African Americans. And also self-report measures may introduce response biases. Regardless, the study had several implications, such as considering urban planning policies that consider ethnic or racial neighborhood composition, as well as implementing different intervention strategies that address acculturative dissonance, especially for minority youth. And finally, for future directions, we would like to look into longitudinal studies that examine how acculturative dissonance kind of changes and develops over time, as well as more qualitative research, such as interviews, to get a more detailed response or detailed understanding and a subjective experience of these acculturation experiences. In conclusion, this study highlights that racial isolation and the percentage of minority friends are significant predictors of acculturative dissonance. Findings suggest a more complex relationship between neighborhood characteristics, friendships, and cultural adjustments. And findings may contribute to targeted interventions, a deeper understanding of the acculturation process, and policies that support healthy cultural integration among immigrant and multicultural individuals. Thank you.